Okay, so I have quite a lot of information I want to present, and as a consequence, I would like to only take clarifying questions during the discussion. I mean, during the presentation, and it's kind of revealing, right? Actually, I won't be taking any questions at all. Just be pontificating. No, sorry, clarifying questions only during the discussion, if we could. God, I did it again. As much as I might disparage Freud, no. But so here's an outline of the talk. Basically, I want to continue with the sort of thing I did last time, which is to present what I see as a theoretical framework. Much of it not original, some suggestions for things that might be explored. The idea here is for it to be educational, so this is largely aimed at the students. For some people, this will be review. But then at the end, I'd like to present some actual data, which may or may not be relevant. But to briefly describe the theoretical structure, first, so the idea here is to look at taboos as a way of exploring the relationship between culture and mind. It's not that there's anything intrinsically important about taboos. Anthropologists studied them for a long time just because they're kind of a striking feature of belief systems that stand out, and therefore they're easy to note and compare and so on. But the argument here is not that there's any special design in the mind for taboos, or that there's any special feature of culture that generates taboos, but rather this is just a useful focus for thinking about the relationship between culture and mind. And importantly, I think there are two sort of logically different perspectives that complement one another in thinking about cultural transmission in general and taboos in particular. And one is what I'm calling here the top-down view, including epidemiological approaches. I'm going to have a general category that I'll just call mimetic selection. Whether you like the word meme or not seems to be a matter of personal preference. But what I'm talking about here is basically why some ideas flourish, why they become widespread, and why others do not. And as part of that, since I'm talking about, in particular, rules, I'll address the question of what enforces those rules. Whether there's something intrinsic in the belief itself that makes it self-enforcing, or whether it relies on external social punishment. And that brings up the question of why people punish, the psychology of enforcement. And then the complement to that is a bottom-up view, which is basically what is in people's minds that leads them as actors to acquire beliefs. And here I'll be talking about the notion of an attractor, and trying to complement that perhaps with a contrast between when evolved mental mechanisms misfire, when people acquire beliefs because something in the adaptation is not working properly, versus when a particular kind of emotional experience that I call egocentric empathy seems to be working perhaps the way it's supposed to. And then I'll conclude the theoretical discussion by just pointing out that, that taboos, the acquisition of taboos is a special case of a much more general, and I would argue more important phenomena, which is why people acquire norms at all, as I hinted at the other day when I talked about internalization. Okay. So, starting at the top-down perspective, right? Why a given idea persists in a population of minds is going to be in part due, and here Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson are some of the have presented some of the best models and evidence for this, although other people in various incarnations, including Dan, have made similar points. But the persistence of an idea is going to, in part, be due to the fitness consequences that it has. I mean here, biological fitness, the likelihood that an individual will survive and reproduce, right? And this is going to be true at the individual level. So what are the consequences of the idea for the likelihood that the individual who holds it will survive and reproduce? And at the group level, with regard to the probability that the group of individuals who hold this idea will continue over time replicating itself, right? Now, obviously, some ideas are more individually fitness enhancing than others, and some can be quite costly. In the United States a few years ago, we had a suicide cult that believed that a comet that approached the Earth was actually an alien spaceship. All the members killed themselves thinking that they would be beamed up by the spaceship. That idea is no longer in existence, in the sense that we only have the historical memory of it, because all the people who believed it are gone, right? It's obviously a fitness costly from an individual perspective idea. There can be fitness enhancing ideas, right, that are individually fitness enhancing. Pronatalist religions that encourage individuals to reproduce, that encourage them to abstain from actions such as smoking and drinking that are harmful. Those are individually fitness enhancing. And because individuals who have those ideas will leave more copies of themselves, to the extent that there is any vertical transmission of the idea will be successful as well. Right? We can contrast this with the consequences that an idea will have for the fitness of a group. Right? And here, importantly, you can have individually costly ideas that are group beneficial, right? So throwing yourself on the grenade for the welfare of your band of brothers, volunteering for any kind of dangerous activity, running into burning buildings, etc. These are all actions which are highly individually costly, and although some evolutionary psychologists bend over backwards looking for ways to make them individually beneficial, they are not, right? Dead is dead. The people who run into the burning buildings have a much greater likelihood of being dead. And the fact that maybe their children, if they're lucky, get some kind of community charity and recognition of their parents' sacrifice in no way makes up for the fitness costs of being dead. Right? So why do such beliefs exist? Well, one possibility is that groups that have them do better than groups that do not. That is, some such ideas, such as be willing to sacrifice yourself for the welfare of the group, will do better than groups that don't have those ideas, because individuals will engage in group beneficial behavior even when it's costly for themselves. Now, the relative importance of the individual level selection and the group level selection will depend on a lot of things, and it's going to vary perhaps by time, place, and the idea that we're talking about, right? In particular, there is debate over the importance of group level selective processes versus individual level selective processes in the history of our species. I think that's an open question, and I'm not convinced that it's ever going to be satisfactorily fully resolved. But in addition, for any particular instance, the size of the costs and benefits can vary. So in the example of self-sacrificial behavior, the cost of the individual is very large. The question is the benefit to the group large, right? And one would expect ideas to persist and flourish where individuals who kill themselves generate a huge group benefit. Individuals who kill themselves for very small group benefit, if you see a piece of litter on the street and a bus is approaching, you should run out and grab the piece of litter, right? Highly costly at the individual level, group benefit is quite small. Group selection is not going to enhance the persistence of that idea or its spread over time. Right? Now, when we turn to the question of taboos, particularly, I'm going to focus mostly on food taboos. That's one of the papers that was assigned as reading. Notice I didn't say that you read. Anthropologists for a long time have come up with creative ways of, and rather gymnastic, I would say, of finding some benefit, either individual level benefit or group level benefit, to the existence of food taboos. Almost uniformly, these collapse when subjected to careful scrutiny. Okay, so many people will tell you, yes, the Hebrew prohibition on pork that the Muslims then adopted, right? Well, this is a very functional, individually functional, and as a consequence, group functional idea, because trichinosis, of course, is transmitted by pork. Well, at present, the Chinese are more than a quarter of the world's population, and they're doing quite well eating lots of pork. Thank you very much. So it's wrong at both the individual and the group level account. And this is true for almost everything. So people come up with very, very elaborate, well, the reason that those people don't eat this very large source of protein is because they're actually reserving it for emergency situations in which then they can break the taboo and eat the large source of protein. But it turns out that the people on the other side of the river do eat that large source of protein, and that protein has legs and moves around. So no, it's not going to be in the refrigerator, as it were, when you need it, right? So despite the creativity with which scholars have attempted to come up with group level and individual level functionalist explanations of taboos, food taboos, they usually don't hold up, right? Now, interestingly, not all taboos are individually costly, but many of them are. Costs vary across them. But one thing that we see is that during times of crisis, when food is in short supply, for example, people break those costs. In other words, they break those taboos. In other words, there's an acceptable cost that they're willing to pay to maintain the taboo, and when the cost gets too great, they break the taboo, right? So the question is, why, given that, why do the taboos persist? One possibility is that there's some other individual level benefit. People are willing to pay the cost when it's not too high of conforming to the taboo because it does something. In particular, referencing my earlier talk, conformity to particularly conspicuous rules signals group membership. It signals that you know the culture of the group and that you value the culture of the group and that you care about the opinion of other members of the group of yourself. And as a consequence of this, these kind of florid displays, if you will, even if they're mildly costly, the cost can be recouped in terms of greater inclusion in cooperative ventures, as I argued earlier, right? Another possible explanation for why individual level costly taboos persist is that they don't provide any benefit to individuals. There's no signaling function of conformity to them, but rather individuals are susceptible to such ideas because they're being parasitized. Some aspect of their mind that actually is functional normally is being taken advantage of by the particular idea, and I'll go into that a little bit more detail later. Okay. Now, another factor that contributes to whether a given idea persists or dies out at the group level is going to be what we can call Sperberian and or Boyerian. Is it Sperber or Speber? I'm just constantly confused. Is it Boyer or Boyer? How long do you have to live in the United States before your name changes? At any rate, attractors, that is, and it came to my attention that not everybody understood this term, although it's been used quite a lot so far, so let me just briefly point out that the way that I'm using it here, what I mean is that there is something about the minds that hold representation, some feature of those minds, that makes some ideas easier to acquire, easier to remember, and perhaps more fascinating to transmit. Okay? And what that thing is may vary very much from instance to instance in the case of the beliefs, right? And this is actually an idea which is, I would say, a more rigorous formulation of an idea that's been around in traditional cultural anthropology for a long time. So just citing here, I'm not even going to try the French versus English pronunciations. You can read them. These are all various anthropologists who have, from one perspective or another, argued that some ideas are good to think, meaning that there's something about the idea that people find resonates with their intuitions, they find it conducive to think this way, and as a consequence of that, those ideas will succeed in a marketplace of ideas because more individuals will be attracted to them, more individuals will retain them and pass them on, etc. But that requires an explanation of individual level psychology, and that's the bottom-up part that I'm going to talk about later in the talk. Okay? Something else that clearly makes a difference in which ideas persist and which die out is the question of enforcement. That is, particularly when we're talking about prohibitions, things that you must not do, right? The matter of enforcement matters a lot because it's a lot easier to say, well, there are things that you can do if you want to, but you don't have to, things that you might not want to do, but if you want to, you can. There's going to be a range of behaviors in society for ideas of this class, but when you say you must not do this, right, the question is, what enforces that prohibition? And I want to draw a dichotomy here between intrinsic punishments where the belief itself contains the consequences of the violation of the belief, and social punishments where the belief doesn't say anything about what happens to people who violate it, and it relies on actors in the social world inflicting costs on people who violate it. Okay? So let's turn first to intrinsic punishment beliefs. So if you eat the tabooed food, then your children will be stillborn, your crops will fail. A variety of bad things will happen to you at various levels of specificity, right? Well, beliefs of this type are going to have high mimetic fitness, meaning that they're going to be likely to persist quite well in a population and spread for a variety of reasons, right? First of all, and this is moving a little bit towards the level of individual psychology, the kinds of precaution systems that Pascal talked about, right, should be attuned to social information, right? If people tell you don't eat yellow-spotted mushrooms, right, you should very much be, because they're dangerous and bad things will happen if you do, right? You should be very sensitive to that information. You should acquire it rapidly, retain it, and so on, right? Because the costs of doing the experiment yourself are very high, right? If they tell you, you will die if you eat yellow-spotted mushrooms, and you think, yeah, maybe, I'll find out for myself, thank you, right? So we would expect natural selection to have, as Pascal suggested, have created a set of mechanisms in the mind for acquiring social information in areas where doing the experiment yourself is very costly. In the terms that I used earlier, we should expect there to be structurally rich social information acquisition mechanisms. They should have a lot of priors in them, right? And because of this expectation, these create an attractor. So when people tell you, if you do X, which is forbidden, whatever X is, bad things will happen to you, you have a built-in vulnerability, as it were, to acquire that information and not test it out, right? Not see whether it's true or not, because of the utility of many beliefs of this type, and that creates the opportunity for parasitism, for false beliefs that not in the child experiment with Smarty's sense, but in the sense of a belief that is not empirically true about the world, right? It is not the case that there really are ancestors, not in the sense of representations, but in the sense of entities in the world that can act on you, and it is not the case that they will cause your children to be stillborn if you go into the garden when you are menstruating, right? That's a false belief. Why do people acquire it? Because they have a structurally rich social information acquisition mechanism in their heads that leads them to grab onto information about danger that other people tell them that would be costly to test out for yourself, right? Obviously, the cost of testing will, even independent of the question of the attractor, if the belief contains information about really bad things happening to you, then even if we hold aside the question of individual psychology and attractors, right, most people are not going to do the experiment, right? As I mentioned to a number of people, the example was designed to illustrate conformist bias transmission, but I spent almost 3 years in this Indonesian village where people believe in ghosts, and the whole time I told myself, you know, one of these nights where there's no moon, I'm going to go sit in the graveyard, have a picnic, just hang out, right? And every time that it was a dark night, I think, you know, it looks like it's going to rain, or you know, maybe I'll do it next time, right? I mean, now this is testimony to the impact of a consensually held belief on the learner, myself in this case, right? But it also speaks to this question of the cost of testing the belief, right? I mean, what if they're right? Even if there's only a tiny fraction of a percent that they're right, right? What if they're right, then very bad things might happen, right? Okay. Now, in addition to this, if the belief is structured in a variety of ways, individuals will not only just accept it, but they may actually see empirical evidence that confirms it in the world. That is, their own experience will convince them, yes, this is a true idea, right? One is if the negative consequences are structured in a sufficiently vague way, okay? So if the belief says, you know, if you eat the right rear hindquarters of a red kangaroo and you're of the, you know, the intermediate male age set, then bad things will happen to you. And that's all it says. Bad things will happen to you. Well, bad things always happen to people, right? I mean, crap happens in the world, and as a consequence of this, right, you have the kind of Jovian situation where, you know, sooner or later a bad thing happens, and either the actor himself or herself or some observer says, ate the right rear hindquarters of the red kangaroo. That's why that bad thing happened, right? So people will come up with, independently, will come up with spurious causal correlations that confirm the belief. So vaguely worded self-enforcing beliefs will have very high mimetic fitness, because not only will people not try and do the experiment at some fairly high rate, but people who do actually violate the belief will likely come up with their own confirming evidence of it, right? Another way that this can happen is if the event is fairly common but doesn't have an obvious cause. So if you eat the right rear hindquarters of the red kangaroo, then your baby will die. Well, babies die all the time, right? I mean, often in small-scale societies, infant mortality in the first year of life can go between 25 and 50%, right? So lots of kids are dying, and it's not clear exactly why they die, right? I mean, sometimes they die when they get squashed and things like that, but often they die for no really visible, evident reason. If there are misfortunes like this that are, while not being vague, that is, there's something discrete, your baby will die, but if they're linked in the belief in such a way that that people will often see evidence in support of the belief, then the belief will have high mimetic fitness, right? Okay. Now, interestingly, beliefs that have intrinsic punishment in them can also be socially punished. So people will say, yeah, bad things will happen, your crops will fail, your babies will die, etc. And we're mad at you, and we're going to inflict costs on you. We're going to exclude you from the group, maybe even hurt you or take things away from you. Okay? Now, there are multiple possible reasons why this takes place. One, as I'll suggest earlier, there may be the nature of social punishment may be such that people are actually looking for opportunities to punish other people. So any rule violation, whether it has intrinsic enforcement or not, may give people an opportunity to jump on other people. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But then in addition, people may reason that they want to avoid incidental consequences of your rule violation, right? So you did something bad. If I tolerate your bad behavior, then I implicitly endorse it, and by doing so, I may suffer the consequences of your bad behavior. So the gods hate those who tolerate sin. I have to. I don't really want to punish you, but I have to. Otherwise, I'll suffer the same fate as yourself, right? I think it's an ethnographic question in any given instance whether or not people engage in this reasoning process, but it can certainly enhance the mimetic fitness of a prohibition. Right? Now, I don't have any hard data to support this, but it certainly seems to be the case that beliefs which are only socially punished, that don't have any intrinsic punishment attached to them, can still have high mimetic fitness. So you can have beliefs that persist over time, even though the only thing that is keeping people from violating the rule is that other people will inflict costs on them. And this leads to the question of why people care what other people do. Okay? Now, the trouble is we're all human beings, and so we consult our intuitions and we say, well, of course people care what other people do, right? But that is actually the phenomenon and not the explanation. Okay? For the evolutionist, the fact that people care what other people do is actually quite puzzling, particularly when those other people are unrelated, so there's no direct fitness benefit. They're not members of your coalition, so there's no interest in their welfare because of your own welfare in terms of how they can help you in the future. And what's more, even when they're your rivals, right? Okay? Why do people, going back to the incest example, right? Why do people get agitated about first-degree relative consensual sibling incest, as John Haidt's experiment shows, right? You might think that if people are your rivals, hell, let them go do something that, just takes them out of the mating market, even if it isn't, individually fitness decreasing. Why do American men get so agitated about male-male homosexuality, right? You think, well, that lowers the competition, right? I mean, the more guys that you would expect heterosexual men to be out there encouraging, right? They should be marching in the gay pride parades, right? Come on, guys. If you're thinking about the switch, do it, right? And yet, of course, people, the American homosexuality case is an interesting cultural, particularly bounded cultural phenomenon, but people obviously care a lot about what other people do. They will pay huge costs in order to inflict punishment on people whose behavior has no effect on them, right? And a simple natural selection perspective suggests this shouldn't happen, because individuals who are indifferent to what others did wouldn't pay those costs, and as a consequence would have higher fitness. So we need some explanation for why people have a moralistic punitive psychology, and that's what comes next, right? So as Pierre noted, John Haidt has done nice experiments with moral dumbfounding, the point here is that people are not doing some rational cost-benefit calculation about what happens when they get angry at and want to punish other people. At least some of the time. Certainly some people may do that some of the time. They may be true Machiavellian actors that see opportunities to punish others in ways that would benefit themselves, get rid of rivals, or advertise something about yourself, something I'll come to in a moment. But a lot of the time it seems that people are just they're just acting on the basis of a reaction that they don't fully understand themselves, as those dumbfounding experiments nicely suggest. Now, there's another possibility, and this was Westermarck's explanation more than a century ago, right? So, just for those of you not familiar with it, Westermarck observed that in places where people have prescribed marriage, in the case that he observed in Morocco, it was first cousin marriage, as Larry was talking about among the Batak. But if the architecture of social relations is such that the individuals who are supposed to marry each other grow up in the same household, then despite the prescription that they should marry, they often don't want to. And when they do, their marriages are less successful. And there's been over a century of people collecting essentially natural experiment evidence in this regard. And interestingly, I think that the case that Larry mentioned is one of these, in that people say one ought to marry one's impal, one's particular kind of cousin, and yet because those cousins grew up together, they say it would be like marrying your sibling, right? And that would be icky. So Westermarck had the idea, having read, knowing something about biological fitness, had the idea that there is essentially a naturally selected psychological mechanism that leads individuals to avoid mating with those with whom they grew up, because most of the time those individuals will be closely related to one another. So propinquity during childhood is just a cue that a kin recognition mechanism uses, right? But Westermarck, who of course was a contemporary of Freud's, didn't stop there. He and Freud argued about this because Freud said, look, the reason people don't have incest is because there are rules against it, right? And the reason those rules against it exist is in part because the minds that are struggling with this desire, okay? So it is the repression of the desire that creates the taboo, and that taboo then is duplicated in future minds. And Westermarck said, no. People don't want to have incest. It's not that they're repressing the desire. The reason the taboo exists is because when other people engage in that behavior, it reminds them of the possibility of their own behavior, that is, they could have sex with their sibling. And that reminder evokes the aversive reaction that is part of the adaptation. So this is really a misfire explanation, right? That is, the taboo is an accident of the fact that when you see other people, or know about other people engaging in incest, it reminds you of the possibility. It brings online the psychology that exists only to guide your own behavior. There's nothing in there about why you care about other people. It's just an accident. It's a misfire. Right? So that's a possibility. This is all, I'm just giving you kind of general background. Now I'll give you maybe some theoretically more rigorous approaches to the question of why people have a punitive moralistic psychology. One body of arguments involves group selection. And again, since discussion has suggested that not everybody is familiar with these issues, the idea here is that although natural selection normally acts on individuals in the sense that there is competition between members of the same species with regard to copies of themselves that they leave in future generations, and selection is the process wherein individuals who are more successful come to leave more copies of themselves, and as a consequence, their attributes become more common in the population. Straight Darwinian natural selection. Group selection, which interestingly Darwin himself toyed with when it came to human beings, group selection, on the other hand, is the idea that selection can act at the level of the group, and that groups that are more successful than competing groups, meaning that their members flourish more, perhaps they recruit more members, will ultimately outcompete groups that are less successful. So, for example, if agriculture allows you to have higher population densities, then you will outcompete hunter-gatherers, a way of making a living that requires a low population density, just because you can mass larger armies than they can bring to the field. Okay? That's a group selection argument about why the practice of agriculture would spread. Okay? Now, group selection can be either cultural in nature, okay? So we can contrast the crazy Americans who killed themselves for the comet, for example, with Mormons, a group that's been brought up in the past, right? Mormonism is an extremely successful group in the sense that it's rapidly acquiring new members and increasing its membership internally. It's pronatalist. People are encouraged to have large families, and people are avid in their recruitment of new members. Young men have a mandatory period where they must go and evangelize others. Okay? Well, this means it's a very successful group in the sense that it is outcompeting other groups that are not as expansionist. Over time, eventually, Mormonism will come to be one of the dominant religions in the world. That's a cultural group selection argument. But interestingly, there can be a relationship between cultural group selection and ordinary natural selection via a process which I'm not a theoretical biologist, and theoretical biologists argue about exactly what to call this, but I'm going to call here the Baldwin effect. Okay? And this is a pseudo-Lamarckian effect. So you remember that Lamarck thought that, unlike Darwin, Lamarck thought that acquired characteristics could be passed on. The giraffe has a long neck because it's stretched to reach the long leaves. Its neck got a little longer, and so its babies had slightly longer necks, right? Well, the Baldwin effect is a pseudo-Lamarckian one that specifies innate structure for a task that previously was achieved without a lot of innate structure. Okay? So if organisms engage in some new behavior, there's a flock of birds, normally they eat red berries, one of the birds accidentally eats a blueberry, discovers that blueberries actually taste pretty good, and he seems to do just fine, so he starts eating blueberries. Right? If over time, and others, there's emulation, others start eating blueberries because they have simple emulation mechanisms in their head that allow them to acquire dietary information from others. Over time, lots of members of the group are eating blueberries, and they do just fine eating blueberries. This is a learned behavior, right? There's no innate structure other than the simple emulation mechanism, which is not specific to blueberries. But now if there's a mutation in which a chick has an attraction to blue objects and therefore pecks at blueberries sooner, right? Doesn't require emulation in order to gain this aspect of the diet, that individual will have higher fitness. That is, selection has created some innate structure that enhances the acquisition of a behavior that previously was being generated using simple domain general mechanisms. Okay? That's what I want to call the Baldwin effect. Right, where we get biological internalization, we get through natural selection the generation of innate structure that enhances a behavior that previously occurred only through general learning and could be cultural in origin. Okay? So if it is the case that groups that have norms that are punished through social enforcement do better than groups that do not, okay, which is perfectly reasonable, right? If you think about it, that's basically what police are for, right? Is enforcing norms that are group functional much of the time, right? Okay, you can't overgraze the commons. If you do overgraze the commons, then we will punish you. That's a norm, okay? Groups that have that will have a more successful commons than groups that do not, and as a consequence, cultural group selection will favor the spread of norms of this type that are socially enforced. But the Baldwin effect can kick in, right? And that if it's easier for some people to learn to be punitive, right? Or perhaps if they are innately punitive, they have a predisposition to engage in punishment, right? Then they don't have the problem of constantly needing to internalize norms of punishment. All that they need to do is know what is the proper behavior, don't overgraze the commons, and I have a predisposition to be punitive towards those individuals. I automatically have the second norm, as it were. That's cultural group selection complying with the Baldwin effect. Now there's another kind of group selection, which is where the group itself is a biological entity. You can think of a beehive, for example, right? And there's a lot of argument over whether biological group selection could or couldn't happen in our species. There's certainly a plausible case to be made that there's something special about us, that degrees of relatedness among hunter-gatherers are higher than is typical for mammals of our size in such groups, and that therefore groups can be thought of as a collection of kin, much the way a beehive is a collection of kin, and so biological group selection could happen. That could include the predisposition to be punitive, because punishing members of the group who do things that are bad for the group is in the group's interest, and the group is a single biological entity. But because that debate is unresolved, I won't say anything more about biological group selection. Now, there's another argument for how you can have a disposition to be punitive that doesn't have anything to do with group selection per se. Instead, it has to do with individual selection. That is, individuals who have such a disposition do better than individuals do not. And this is largely because of the possibility of signaling that I mentioned the other day, right? So if it's the case that well-enculturated individuals, those who have the knowledge of the members of their group, are more predictable and therefore more attractive as coalition members, the argument that I made the other day, right? Then individuals who have a disposition to conform to norms, including norms about when to punish other people, right, don't associate with pedophiles. There's a norm that seems to be quite prevalent in the United States right now. Okay, pedophiles are bad. You should actively punish them. You should drive them out of your neighborhood, and so on, right? A norm about punishment, right? If by being vociferous in your punishment of pedophiles, you demonstrate that you're a good, predictable, highly enculturated member of the group, then other people think well of you, and they're more likely to include you in a coalition. What's more, if they recognize that it's valuable to have a policer in the group, right? We actually want people who enforce group norms, because our group will do better if we have those people in the group. Then by being really avid in your enforcement of the norms, you can make yourself attractive, because folks want not just a predictable coalition member, but actually somebody who's willing to pay the costs quite regularly. I have some anecdotal evidence from Sumatra that the young men who were the most vociferous in the public infliction of punishment on moral norm violators were the most had the most favorable political trajectories in the village, right? That they were the ones that the elders looked well upon. They saw these guys as aspiring, promising young men. The others just sort of, they were at the back of the mob and not the front of the mob. Elders didn't think so well of them, right? Okay. So there is, at least anecdotal evidence to support this, and if you consult your intuitions, I think you'll see that this is possible, right? Now, there can be, as I suggested, a Baldwin effect, wherein if cultural group selection creates norms that have punishment associated with them, and there's any individual benefit to being punitive, signaling your predictability and so on, then natural selection can build in structure leading individuals to be punitive in this regard. That's a Baldwin effect. You can get feedback loops here, right? Because you might have a few norms like this that generates a little bit of selective pressure for the Baldwin effect type internal structure. Once that structure is there, it may afford more punitive norms, which then generates a little bit more selective pressure and so on. Okay, so you can end up with an efflorescence of norms with punishment associated with them and a strong disposition to be punitive in individual minds. Right? There's another possibility that I'm not going to talk about at all, which is that anything that's costly can allow individuals to demonstrate their genetic quality to prospective mates, and punishment is just an opportunity to do this, but I'm not going to talk about that. Standing on your motorcycle as you race across the chain bridge is potentially costly, demonstrates your genetic quality, doesn't generate any social benefit. Punishment may just be another version of that, is one possibility. But I won't go beyond that. Okay. So then we have to ask, going back to the higher level question, once punishment exists, social enforcement exists, what are the consequences for mimetic fitness? Well, Boyd and Richardson have demonstrated mathematically that this can potentially stabilize any norm. It doesn't have to be a group functional norm. Once punishment exists in the world, wearing ties becomes potentially an evolutionarily stable strategy in the sense that it's an equilibrium. Okay? If you get punished for not wearing ties, I don't know about your universities, but at my university, if you're in the social sciences, you don't have to wear a tie. But if you speak at the medical school, you better be wearing a tie. Okay? If you're male, if you're female, you have the equivalent business suit that you have to wear, but not the tie, right? it's a ridiculous norm. It doesn't do anything. Well, if we hold aside the signaling conformity issue, but it's clearly punished, right? People think poorly of doctors who don't wear ties when they walk around the medical school. And perhaps, those people have fewer opportunities, less promotion, fewer friends, etc., right? It's not group functional. It's just stabilized by punishment, right? But a point, in addition to Rob and Pete's argument, that I would like to make here is that if, through this Baldwin effect that I've described, individual minds have a disposition to be punitive, okay, then this creates a market for taboos, as it were, for rules which, when they're broken, give you the opportunity to exercise your punitive muscles, okay? If people have this disposition, because it's individually selected, that is, being punitive gives you an opportunity to demonstrate to other members of the group what a good group member you are, and therefore how much they should want you in their coalition, then anything out there, any suggestion about what might be proper or improper behavior, you can seize on as an opportunity for you to display this otherwise invisible attribute of yourself. Yes, Larry?
Being disposed to follow norms doesn't give you the same fitness advantage?
Being disposed, my argument is that being punitive is just another version of that, in the sense that it's another kind of conformity to the norm. So you can have a norm that says you must wear a tie, and you can have a higher order norm that says you should ostracize people who don't wear ties, right? And if you both wear a tie and ostracize people who don't wear ties, then you're getting a double whammy in the sense of advertising two things simultaneously.
But there's not more of a cost to do the latter.
Yes. Well, one of the points that I wanted to make, perhaps I didn't articulate it well, is that punishment will often be, not necessarily, so ostracism, for example, the cost may not be that high, but punishment will often be more costly than a variety of other kinds of conformity to norms. And the more costly the action is, the more it shows how deeply you've internalized the norms, how predictable you are, and so on, right? So this suggests, for example, that individuals, you should be able to predict individual differences in the propensity to engage in costly punishment as a function of their need for and opportunities for inclusion in future coalitions, right? So the young men in the village, they're the ones who are striving to get somewhere. The old guys, they've already got there, okay? So it's the young men who are really florid in their advertisement of their internalization of these norms, and are willing to put themselves in physical danger in order to demonstrate how much, I mean, not at any conscious level, they're just mad is what's going on approximately, right? But what they're doing at the ultimate level is they're demonstrating, they're competing for opportunities in valuable coalitions, and they're demonstrating how good they are. Yeah. Okay, so this then brings us to the question of the psychology of taboo acquisition. Obviously, we've shifted to an individual mind's perspective in talking about punishment, right? I mentioned before this notion of an attractor with regard to hazard precaution systems. That should be particularly relevant for intrinsically enforced taboos, as I said earlier, with regard to the mushroom example, right? And if this is the explanation for why individuals acquire taboos, then, as I said earlier, non-individually fitness-enhancing taboos are simply parasitizing a mechanism that's working exactly the way it's supposed to work, and the mechanism just can't discriminate between useful information and useless information, right? I mentioned the Westermarckian idea, right? Now, Westermarck actually framed his argument as an explanation for why where incest taboos came from originally, but we can use the same argument to explain why individuals would acquire them. So somebody says to you, siblings should not have sex. Just that statement in itself brings online the possibility of you having sex with your sibling. You get this resonance, and you say, "Oh, what a terrible idea! You know, siblings having sex." I agree with the idea that they should not. Right? That's a misfiring, as I said earlier. Another possibility is this particular emotional reaction, which, as I said, I call egocentric empathy. And I contrast this with normal empathy, in that normal empathy is when you experience the state of the individual with whom you are empathizing. Egocentric empathy is when your state is different from the individual whom you're observing, and what you're experiencing is what you would feel if you were in that person's shoes. Okay? So we watch a baby eat poop. The baby is having a grand old time eating poop, and we feel nauseated. Okay? Baby's not nauseated, okay? But we're nauseated. Okay? So this is egocentric in the sense that it isn't true empathy. If it was true empathy, we'd be happy. Baby's happy, right? It's egocentric. It's about our own reactions, right? My speculative hypothesis is that egocentric empathy is actually normally adaptive because individuals who engage in behaviors that put them at risk of contamination or predation put the people around them at risk also. Okay? If they're bringing disease into the group, as it were, you're at risk. If they're bringing predators into the group, you're at risk. Okay? And interestingly, disgust and fear are the emotions that it's easiest, you can do the thought experiment yourself, it's easiest to experience egocentrically, empathically. It's pretty hard to experience a bunch of other emotions this way. Okay? So think about, can you experience egocentric empathic regret? So there's a guy who's irresponsible at work, and he's always late, and finally the boss fires him, and he says, "Well, I don't care, what the hell," and he walks away, right? Can you say, "Oh no, I'm really sorry I was late all those times," in the way that you say, "Ew, disgusting," when you see baby eating poop? Probably not, right? That is, at least I don't think I can. So disgust and fear seem particularly prone to facilitate egocentric empathy, and that would normally be adaptive, but it can misfire, okay, in the sense that if you have some information about a possible taboo, right, and some slight disposition to see that in a negative light, and then you see somebody engage in the behavior, a Muslim eats pork, whatever, then you can have this egocentric empathic reaction, contaminant in our midst, I feel disgust, that would reinforce the belief in yourself. But of course this is a misfire because eating pork doesn't in fact put the group at risk of disease, right? I talked before about structure-rich social information acquisition mechanisms for learning about diet. Why? Because of ecological variation in the habitats that humans occupy and the cost of individual learning. And as I argue at length in the paper, and therefore won't go into detail here, meat is a prepotent stimulus for humans. We easily acquire conditioned food aversions towards meat and experience disgust towards meat. It's a valuable source of food, but it's also a potential source of disease. Those mechanisms are individually normally adaptive, but they may also serve as attractors for socially transmitted information. So if I tell you don't eat carrots, your babies will die if you eat carrots, it doesn't resonate. But if I say right rear hindquarter of the red kangaroo, you go, oh, it's a meat thing, right? And so it brings online the psychology that's normally adaptive, but in this case is not, right? As I said, taboos, of course, are just one instance of norms, and when punishment exists in the world and there is motivation to punish, I would argue for the signaling reasons that I've described, right? Then individuals should always look for the prevailing pattern of behavior and they should moralize it. I mentioned this the other day, right? So this will happen even when, in fact, it isn't a norm in the sense of being an explicit belief. So most people are right-handed in all populations, and we get a derogation of the use of the left hand. The left hand is seen as polluting. In English, we have sinister, of course, deriving from the left. This is an example of the propensity to moralize the prevailing pattern of behavior. Why is it adaptive to moralize it? Because you conform to it if you moralize it, and you're punitive towards individuals who don't, and so you have the opportunity, the dual opportunity for signaling. And I would just add here that although conformist transmission, the tendency to do when in Rome what the Romans do, will often be individually adaptive, you'll get an effective behavior, it doesn't explain moralization. Right? You shouldn't have this deep sense that this is the only way to do it, and any other way means the person is bad. Right? So you need the existence of punishment and some argument about the psychology of punishment in order to explain why people moralize. Okay, I've spent much too long on theory, but now I want to very, very rapidly, I'm going to fly through this, present you with two different bodies of material which speak to two different aspects of the argument that I've been describing. One is what can be interpreted, depends on your position, that's how I interpret it, as preliminary evidence supporting reputational arguments for prosocial behavior. So norm conformity and punitive attitudes towards norm violators are just one subcategory of general prosocial behavior. And then I'll turn, if there's time, to an interesting possible example of what happens when cultural evolution may grab onto an individually functional, evolved psychological mechanism. So let's turn first to prosociality. So this work was done with Kevin Haley, and the idea here is very simple. If the feelings that motivate prosociality, if the whatever psychological architecture that we have that leads us to be prosocial exists in part to signal our value as cooperative partners, then there should be audience effects. You should feel more strongly motivated to be prosocial when others can observe your actions. And this should be true even at the level of simple elementary cues of observability. So we've already heard some about this. I think you'll find these experiments perhaps consonant with some of the arguments that, for example, Gerge has made about the cue value of particular stimuli. Okay? So what did we do? We have a one-shot anonymous dictator game. Nikolai mentioned the dictator game the other day. It's a simple game. Individuals play anonymously, in this case via a computer interface. They don't know with whom they're playing. Player 2 is a completely passive agent, has no role in the game other than to receive money. But we don't use deception in experiments for reasons that I won't go into, so there needs to be a player 2. You give player 1 $10, tell player 1 you can transfer via the computer any portion of this to player 2. From 0 to 10, up to you, right? Got a nice big sample, and then we use 3 manipulations to create 5 different conditions as follows, okay? Some of the subjects interact with a computer interface that looks pretty much like your standard computer desktop, but some of the subjects interact with a computer interface that looks like this, okay? And no explanation is given as to why this is the desktop that they're interacting with. It's just presented there. It's just kind of an aesthetic thing, okay? And we call this the eye spots condition, okay? Now, why are we doing this? Because this is a cue of observability, okay? The presence of eyes facing in your direction in an ancestral environment should have been a reliable indicator that there were opportunities for reputational consequences of your actions. That is, people could see what you were doing, and if you did the right thing, they think one thing of you, and if you did the wrong thing, they think something else, okay? Now, there's another channel, of course, of information, and that's the auditory one. So in some of the conditions, we put these big plastic headphones on people like they use at the airport, the idea being that if you can hear people in your proximity, then there's a possibility that they will find out what you're doing. If you can't hear them, right, then there's less likelihood, that is, you are fooling the system into thinking that you are more alone, okay? Because these are very mechanical systems, is our argument, okay? And we combine these in various ways, okay? So we can have individuals who only have the earmuffs on and see the regular computer interface. We can have individuals who only see the eye spots but can hear the people around them. We can have individuals who have the eye spots and can't hear. Now, in that case, we have conflicting cues, right? Because if you have the eye spots, you have the cue that you are being observed, but if you can't hear people, then you have the cue that you're less observed, okay? Now, we predict that the eye spot should have a stronger effect to increase prosocial behavior, then the earmuffs should decrease it, because if eyes are facing in your direction, you know people are watching you, but if you can hear people in your vicinity, they might be watching you or they might not, okay? So the auditory channel should be less powerful than the visual channel in this regard. And finally, we did one more thing consistent with the cue validity argument, which is we skewed the eye spots, because normally eyes are in the same horizontal plane. It should be a less valid cue when they're skewed. And then, very simply, all that we do is we measure how much player 1 transferred to player 2 in these various conditions. This is a between subjects design. Each subject only plays the game once and in only one condition. Okay? And here are the results. On the y-axis, you have the probability that the player 1 will allocate anything. As I said the other day during the discussion of Nikolai's work, if people allocate, they typically allocate about 20% of their endowment. So it's a binary decision. There's not a lot of variance around that allocation. Okay? Along the y-axis arranged as bars, you have the various conditions. So over here, we have the individuals who cannot hear the people around them and are looking at a regular computer interface, so they're not getting a queue of observation, right? And this is, they transfer around half, if, that is, they have a 50% probability of transfer. Okay, they transfer around 20%, but about half of the people are transferring. Slightly more pro-social at UCLA, interestingly, than is typical of Western societies, but there you go. I don't know. You wouldn't know it walking around UCLA. Okay. These are people who are, this is the regular control condition in the sense that they're not wearing the headphones, they can hear the people around them, and they're just looking at a regular computer interface, and a little slight blip up there, right? So they're getting more information about observability than these people are. That difference, as you might guess, is not statistically significant, right? These are the people who are getting the visual cue but are not getting the auditory cue, right? And now they're more likely to transfer, okay, because the visual cue is quite powerful, right? These people are getting the visual cue and are getting the auditory cue, but the visual cue is degraded by being skewed, right? And here are the people who get the full suite of information in the sense that, hang on just a second, they're getting the eye spots on the computer and they can hear the people around them. Now, pairwise comparisons between the adjacent pairs here are not statistically significantly different, right? But if you care about the eye spots argument, then what you really want to look at is the control condition versus basically the eye spots conditions here, okay? And either combined or looking at the strongest case here, those are significantly different. So the eye spots alone are making a difference. Yes, clarifying question.
It's really a country detail, but you said there were 248 participants and some of them are listening. So I was just wondering if you had to eliminate.
I don't remember. Sorry, I don't remember. And I'm bad at math, so it didn't even occur to me. Yes?
Do you have a skewed and silent condition?
No, we do not. It's the only condition we have. We could, but we didn't, right? I mean, it's quite laborious to run these, actually. Get people to, you got to disinfect the headphones. Seriously, we did, because there's a contamination avoidance thing that you don't want to, Now, I have some, the next piece of work I want to tell you about very briefly is not my own. It's been around for a couple of years circulating, okay, and it hasn't been published. So because it's not my own, I can't speak to the, the sort of the strength of the rigor with which it was conducted. And because it hasn't been published, we can't sort of say, well, it's been validated by a peer review. So, take it with a grain of salt, basically, okay? But I present it to you because, and also as you'll see, it turns out that only half the results are interesting, right? But I present it to you because it speaks to some of the things that Gerge was talking about in terms of Q validity here. So this Shinobu Kiriyama and students at University of Michigan did this, right? Again, a one-shot anonymous dictator game, same endowment that we used, right? Only now instead of a computer interface, they're using a paper and pencil protocol where people write their decisions on a piece of paper, right? And they have two conditions. In one condition, this is the piece of paper that they write on, okay? And no explanation is given as to why those dots are there. It's just on the piece of paper. And in the other condition, this is the piece of paper that they write on, okay? And then we just measure how much. And so it says, I will give total $10 if you can't read that from back there, right? Okay. You can see why Kiriyama did this, right? I mean, it's playing with the idea, right? Now, first, I'll show you the uninteresting results, which are from female participants, okay? And I don't have an explanation for the sex difference. I don't know whether the authors do, but I don't, okay? And the way that they've presented the data here are the frequencies, rather than probability, of each of the possible transfers. People have to use whole dollar increments in their scenario. They couldn't use fractions thereof, okay? So how many people sent nothing? How many people sent $1, how many people sent 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the control condition, the open bar, versus the presentation of the dots in the face-like orientation, right? And there's not really any clear pattern there, right? So, I mean, this is a significant difference here, suggesting, so you might interpret that as, well, okay, the face makes people a little more generous, but then so is this, and that makes, you would interpret that as face making them less generous. Nothing all that interesting there, but the guys, on the other hand, they're much less likely to send nothing. So the guys, you'll notice, are much more selfish than the guys to start with, right? Than the gals to start with. Many more of the guys in the control condition are willing to send nothing, right? Compare this bar right here to this bar right here, right? The guys are more selfish. That's kind of an interesting observation, but not when the face is there, right? And over here, right? And over here, we're starting to get sort of more clear signs of generosity in the face. Interesting, but as I said, take it with a grain of salt. It hasn't been validated, okay? But before we leave this topic, very quickly, right? Let me tell you about work that was done by Melissa Bateson, Daniel Nettles, and Roberts. I'm gonna promote UCLA at the end here, and I'm happy to say that Daniel Nettles was a visiting fellow in our center. And what did they do? Well, they, did what any good experimentalist would do, right? There's always the question of ecological validity. Take it out of the lab and into the real world. That's exactly what they did, okay? They're at University of Newcastle on Tyne. In their psychology department there, they have coffee and tea and a refrigerator in which milk is kept. And you self-serve, and there's a little box, an honor box, a kitty, whatever version of English you speak, okay, in which you're supposed to pay for the coffee or tea that you drink, okay? It's been this way in the psychology department for as long as anyone can remember, blah, 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 okay? The sign has been up on the wall reminding people, don't forget to pay for the coffee or tea that you drink, right, by putting money into the box. Nothing new there, okay, so the investigators didn't change anything, right? They did add something that I'm going to show you in a minute, right? But before I explain that to you, I have to tell you about their control, because this is absolutely brilliant, okay? There might be variation from time to time in terms of how much coffee and tea gets consumed, okay? Because maybe there are more people in the department, or maybe it's a particularly boring week and everyone needs caffeine, and there could be variation. So you need to control for natural variation independent of your experimental manipulation in terms of the amount of consumption, because what you want to measure, of course, your dependent measure, is how much of what people actually take are they paying for. Okay? So how do you control for that? You measure the amount of milk drunk out of the refrigerator, because being good Brits, they put milk in their coffee and tea. And this tells you something about how much they're consuming. Okay? So that's their control for the baseline. And then their experimental manipulation is to take that sign on the wall and add a little decoration. And here's what they added. Okay? For a week at a time, they put up flowers. Then they put up eyes. No explanation, just pasted them on the wall. Okay? Flowers, eyes, flowers, eyes, flowers, eyes. And this is the pound sterling paid into the box, right? Controlling for the number of liters of milk consumed. Okay? There is an eye spots effect, okay, in the real world. Now, in addition, for if you're interested in the details, it looks like different eyes have different effects. This guy looks particularly punitive in my opinion. She does not look very threatening at all. And there's clearly a difference between these two here, right? Okay. Do people? Sorry?
Those are direct.
Yes, they are direct. Yes, there's every reason to think that the direction of the gaze should matter. Right? Absolutely, of course, because oblique gazes, they're not observing your behavior. Right? I have pretty reasonable confidence in the power of eye spots to promote prosocial behavior, right? And from that, I think it's reasonable to conclude that people just feel more like doing the right thing, right? Being prosocial, being punitive towards norm violators, etc. I mean, obviously, I haven't showed you anything about punishment. There are experiments going on about punishment right now. I should say, by the way, for a matter of record, Ernst Fehr, I mean, for historical reasons, this whole thing was set up as a debate between Ernst Fehr and Herb Gintis and Sam Bowles and me and Kevin Haley and some other people. You don't need to know about that, but Ernst Fehr is a very careful and extremely productive experimenter. Has circulated the abstract of a failure to replicate in a different experimental game, one that is in some ways more realistic than the dictator game. Okay, but I haven't seen the paper yet, and so I can't tell you exactly what they did. Right, but that's just in the interest of full disclosure. Right, I think that the way to interpret these results is to say that our evolved psychology has a bunch of mechanisms in it, including obviously sharing with mechanisms designed for pedagogy and predator avoidance and other things, the detection of eyes, right? And that it enhances moral feelings that affect behavior when the reputational consequences of individuals' actions are greater. Okay. Now, I'm at an hour and 3 minutes, and the next thing is about the effects of progesterone on the immune system and how that affects contamination feeling. It's about ethnocentrism and out-group derogation, in-group favoritism, Larry's stuff, but it's going to take more than 5 minutes for me to do. So in the interest of having more discussion, I'll stop. But if people are interested, I can tell you the result right now. Okay. There's a very long story to get there, but the result is that women in the first trimester of pregnancy display more in-group favoritism and more out-group derogation than women in the second and third trimesters of pregnancy. And the first trimester of pregnancy is the period when they are most vulnerable to illness. Okay? That's when the costs of infection are the greatest to them. There's an argument about whether the association between out-group members and disease is part of the evolved psychology or is cultural evolution exploiting the evolved psychology for reasons that Larry suggested earlier with regard to the flow of individuals between groups. It seems unlikely that seeing out-group members as a source of disease is part of the evolved psychology because the epidemiological structure isn't supported. That is, there's no advantage to that association because disease spreads too rapidly. So the suggestion instead is that cultural evolution is exploiting disease avoidance mechanisms by telling you those people over there, choose your favorite, hated outgroup, right, are either vectors for disease or disease themselves or actually the disease itself. And by telling people that, you bring online a psychology of disease avoidance that leads them to be prejudiced, to avoid interaction with them. And we can demonstrate the working of this mechanism by looking at changes as a function of progesterone, because progesterone makes women more susceptible to illness and as a consequence more averse to sources of disease. There, you got the whole story in 2 minutes. Okay, I will stop. Actually, before I take questions, I just realized I want to give my little plug, which is at UCLA we have an extremely stimulating and productive group of people, all of whom are much smarter and more creative than I am. And as I mentioned with regard to Daniel Nettle, we have faculty visitors, and we also have postdoctoral fellows, and what we don't... Whatever. There's just a picture. There's a picture of my friends, is what it was. Never mind. What we don't have is money. We hope to have more money. I'm trying to raise more money. But if you have a source of funds yourself, faculty sabbatical, postdoctoral fellowship, the Fulbright, which brings foreigners to the United States, right? Please come and stay with us, visit us. If you're in town, give a talk with us, etc. And that's that. Okay, I did my job.
I'll visit you from Palo Alto.
Excellent.
Month.
Excellent.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, just a clarification question. You said at one point that once punishment exists, it creates a market for taboos. And I was wondering, it struck me that you seem to assume that I'm going to be punishing people who break taboos. But that's not what really happens. What happens is that people are punished if they break taboos by other entities that are not me and you and people in the business of doing what punishing is good for.
That's an empirical question, and the point that I tried to make in the initial introduction is that there certainly are many taboos that are intrinsically enforced. People don't do anything. It's just the nature of the world is such that if you break the taboo, bad things happen to you. Okay. There are other things. It depends how you define taboo. Okay. Certainly, if you want to say a taboo is only that prohibition that fits the description I just gave, then it rules out prohibitions that people actively punish, and there is no supernatural enforcement or cosmological enforcement. But I would add, I'm actually skeptical of the claim that people engage in no punishment whatsoever for intrinsically enforced taboos, because I think people think poorly of folks who break taboos. And the story of Job, again, just not that the Old Testament is the definitive window onto human psychology. It certainly isn't. But, the story of Job, where people say, you must have done something wrong. That's why bad stuff is happening to you. You must have broken a taboo, basically. And we're not your friends anymore, right? We don't want to hang out with you anymore because, clearly you're a bad guy. Bad things are going to happen to us. I think what often happens is that people worry a lot about getting caught in the crossfire between the deities and the taboo breakers, and they dissociate themselves from them. And that's a form of punishment, right? Ostracism is a form of punishment.
On exactly the same point.
Yeah.
Look, let's just give you an example. I guess in Madagascar it's likely to be fairly similar. So I did all my fieldwork in an Ethiopian society, and I work full-time on the taboo system. And of course, I don't want to make a definitional kind of thing, but just to describe in a few words what happened there. So it's central to the society. It's the system of explanation of misfortune. Witchcraft is hardly ever exists, but it's a very minor source of explanation of misfortune and so on. There are I collect about 1,000 different rules of the local taboo, and of course they get broken by many people quite frequently. Most of these rules, you don't know that people have broken them because they have to do with spinal behavior, and it's not visible, and people may not even be that aware that they have, or they may be vaguely aware and not care. So a thing comes up when there is misfortune. So misfortune happens in every family. So whenever there is misfortune, the question becomes what taboo has been broken by some member of the family. And then there is a public confession. You always find something that's taboo has been broken, but a confession, sacrifice, and you're done with it. Members of the family may disapprove of whoever has confessed to something. So, but punishment in any serious sense, no. People from other households are not going to again, because it occurs everywhere. So you have really a very powerful system of taboos that's playing a really important role in conversation, explanation of misfortune, and also guides behavior to a certain extent. Even though taboos are violated, there is no punishment in any serious sense. There are people, when it comes out, again, you remember family who are the people who may suffer from it, may feel that you shouldn't have done it, but there's always forgiveness, and typically the system is that you blame the action, you don't blame the people. That's also the local one. And there are other rules which are not taboos, which are defined differently, where you have enforcement. So you're quite right. You find other societies, for instance, Polynesia, where taboos are in fact enforced, although they also have physical sanction. But the kind of case I'm describing, and for I understand from Madagascar, it's fairly similar, shows the very possibility of having a very rich system of taboo that does not at all depend on an enforcement system, or if you want to insist it does, very, very marginally so.
Well, I think that's, I have no argument with that, because the point that I made was that intrinsically enforced taboos can have very high mimetic fitness for all of the reasons that I listed. So there's no suggestion that you have to have social enforcement in order for taboos to be evolutionarily stable at a cultural evolution level. On the contrary, once people have the precedent, as it were, that misfortune can be explained by taboo, that opens the door to an endless,
Exactly. The mechanism that you describe, and your description fits very well with the case. So if I may just, again, about the issue of punishment, and it's also, you said, I'm quoting you, that Baldwin and Richard have demonstrated, and I'm thinking we were demonstrated, that a system of enforcement can stabilize any norm, whatever its content. So first, let's be clear that what they demonstrate within the model.
Sure, I said that. I said it was a model.
It doesn't demonstrate anything about what may or may not happen in society, because one of the fit of the modern society.
I said that.
But didn't hear it, but if you said that, let me repeat it then, because I think it's important. It's really important because it comes up in discussions as if this was a fact about human society. It's a fact about models, which depend not just on punishment, but punishing those who don't punish in higher order punishment, which is very unrealistic, I think, in most human societies where you have plenty of norms, but they certainly don't get that much enforcement. So,
I mean, rather than spend the time debating the merits of the Boyden-Richardson model and the question of higher order.
As an instrument for thinking with, but it's not a demonstration of anything that happens in society.
Just in,
I like the work, and that's
as a self-interested academic, I would point out that I have a competing explanation, right? About why these norms exist and so on. Right? But I mean, so just to reiterate, to be clear, right? I started out with a phenomenon. There are taboos in the world. I tried to come up with explanations for why these things can exist. Intrinsically enforced taboos should have high mimetic fitness and can exist in the absence of social punishment. But it's clear that there are taboos, the incest taboo being one, many dietary taboos being another, which are socially enforced, and that that just raises another question, which is, why does anyone care what other people do, right? So that's why I dedicated attention to the question of punishment. It articulates with the signaling argument about norm conformity in general, but it doesn't mean that punishment is necessary for the existence of any belief.
Yeah. So I'm going to continue on these theoretical aspects of your talk and focusing on the group selection bit. I mainly agree with all that you said when you started to talk about psychology, but I really disagree on the idea that I think you don't need group selection to explain what you show. Because you need group selection when you want to explain sacrifice or altruism. The trait whereby an individual is definitely and totally losing some fitness units to the profit of the group. For this, you really need group selection. But to explain just cooperation, so traits whereby individuals are temporarily losing fitness for a future social contribution, this you don't need group selection to explain.
Yeah, no, let me be clear. Okay, so the signaling argument, which is an individual level natural selection argument, right, that says that individuals engage in costly behavior that is culturally dictated. I haven't said whether it's pro-social or not, right? Because by doing so, they demonstrate their predictability to others and their reliability as a consequence, right? And enhance their own inclusion in coalition, thereby enhancing their own fitness. That's a straight, classic natural selection argument, okay? The question, however, is not, that is, and that's, I think, a strong claim about both the origins and the natures of this aspect of the human mind, right? But there is another issue, which is that empirically, when we look around the world and we look at norms, we see that there are lots of norms that do nothing, like wearing ties. But there are also norms which are individually costly and group beneficial, okay? And the question is, where do those norms come from, right? If it were just the case that there's, you know, that the existence of punishment stabilizes norms, whether from a mathematical model or out of this market idea that I suggested, that people actually want norms that they can enforce, right? Then we'd expect all kinds of crazy norms, right? But we wouldn't necessarily expect there to be group functional norms, right? So that group level selection can explain group functional norms that are individually costly, that don't have to do with coalitions. So if it has to do with coalitions, and here the distinction that Larry made between a group and a coalition is very important. If it has to do with coalitions, you don't need the group level selection because individuals want to show their prospective coalition partners, hey, I'm a good coalition player, right? You want me on board, okay? But if it's about this much larger group that includes individuals who are not potential coalition members, then we have to explain why there are so many group functional norms. And group level selection can explain that. It doesn't have to be biological group level selection, as the Mormon example illustrates. It can just be culture level group selection.
Yeah, just to finish on that, but group selection is not needed to explain coalition behavior, is not needed to explain pairwise interaction, cooperative interaction.
I agree.
It's just needed to explain a tiny thing, which is that if you look at several human groups, you will find in average more utilitarian taboos or utilitarian norms than you would have found at average if you had just picked the norms randomly, right?
Well,
that's the only thing that group selection is doing.
Why? I mean, in the version of the story that I have told, right? I mean, so Herb Gintis, Sam Bowles, Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson, each of them, Joe Henrich, each of them would tell you a different story than the one I've told, and they would differ from each other. In the version of the story that I've told, what you need group selection for is to explain, culture level group selection is to explain the existence and the ubiquity of individually costly group functional norms. Okay. Now you can say that are not about coalitions. You can say that's a little thing to explain. Wait, hang on. Let me finish. You can say that's a little thing, right? That's just a little thing because of all the things that people do. That's just a little thing. But you know, the existence of nation states suggests it's not just a little thing. It has huge consequences because you get entities that act at a level that is much larger than the coalition by virtue of those.
I disagree, but we can continue with it.
I had a couple of minor things and then a question. By the way, they're making doctors stop wearing ties because it turns out they never clean their ties. And it's a source of infection in hospitals. There you go.
It's a group costly norm.
Group costly norm. You know, literally in terms of malpractice insurance. The other question I had is, wouldn't taboo debunkers also have some increment of I mean, wouldn't that do something for your social standing?
If well,
Let me
yeah.
do the last one, which is actually more. It seems to me that there's some cultural issues here which I'd like to hear your thoughts on, because the situation you described overwhelmingly describes what's going on in certain parts of the Middle East right now, where the signaling your punitive intentions is apparently a really powerful way of establishing your political clout. But then you have the kinds of situations that Dan and Rita were talking about, where the norms are, the taboos are much less costly, and there doesn't seem to be as much investment in persecuting the norm violator. So I was just wondering what kind of constellation of social and perhaps psychological, but I would imagine it would be more social political properties might contribute to the differential mimetic power, of these patterns in different places.
Okay, so
Does that make sense?
yeah, I think I understand. So let me back up to the first point, which is actually the second point after doctors, which is don't taboo debunkers stand to gain something, and they do. The problem is that particularly for intrinsically enforced taboos that are vague about the nature of the enforcement, people can always point to something, right? So you say, well, I don't follow that rule, right? I mean, there was a guy in the village that I lived in Sumatra who, I mean, this is a Muslim village, and he didn't fast during Ramadan. I mean, that's like breaking a principal rule. There aren't a lot of other, that's kind of like, I don't know, fornicating in public or something. I mean, that's how bad
But
it
less
is.
fun.
Being hungry is no fun. It's the avoidance of pain is not pleasure. He was a pretty healthy guy. He lived a pretty long life. He was not enormously financially successful, but he was reasonably so, right? But, bad things would happen in his life like in everybody's. Family members would die, people die there, they die everywhere, accidents happen. And people could always point to that and say, he doesn't fast, right? So it's not a debunking in the sense that you can't demonstrate proof of the lack of validity of the norm. Now,
but it's a lot cheaper.
Well, I'm not sure that I understand. I mean, he paid social costs. That particular norm has both social and supernatural enforcement there. But I don't know that much about Polynesia. Most of what I know, I got secondhand or thirdhand from Bob Levy, who was one of my mentors years back. His account of the arrival of Christianity in Tahiti was basically that people suffered under an extremely onerous system of taboos, right? I mean, this is the place that gave us the word, right? Polynesia gave us the word taboo. And they just had this enormously baroque and restrictive system of prohibitions on behavior that was evolutionarily stable, right? I mean, but then this totally outside novel source of information arrived, namely Europeans, right? Who said, your cosmology is completely wrong, ours is right. And in Levy's account, the Tahitian said, well, we don't know about this Jesus guy you keep talking about, but maybe you got it right, maybe you didn't, but it's clear that whatever you're doing works better than whatever we're doing, because you don't have to do all this crazy stuff that we have to do, and you have guns and nails and good things like that. So sure, we'll be Christian, right? and that the missionaries were quite disappointed that there were mass conversions without any sincerity, as it were. Right? They just gave up a whole system of taboos that were very costly because there was obvious evidence that you could violate them. Maybe you needed this Jesus guy to protect you from, all the other guys who get mad when you violate the taboos. But okay, so we'll follow the Jesus guy.
That's the origin of Christianity, getting rid of taboos.
Works for me. Yes, Nicola.
The interesting question of wearing tie, I have to comment that on wearing tie, it doesn't seem to be so arbitrary that the cool social scientists want to advertise that they are cool, and so they don't wear a tie, and the serious people in medicine have to attract the client and to be serious. So I'm not sure that it's that arbitrary all that of this social norm. And my second question is about the fact that people punish or at least moralize non-coalitional partner. It seems to me that it could be a costless way to signal your moral standing. If I say to someone about some people that I would never meet or I don't care about what they think about me, and I say they are bad. Like, for example, among my friends, people used to say that right-wing people are racist, people are racist, and it's very bad. And we all think we all talk about people who advertise that you are not racist, and you condemn racism, but all your friends agree with that. It's cheap, I agree, but you display a good opinion, which could be quite useful. We never finished racist people.
Yeah. Okay, so 2 points. First, on the tie, you're absolutely correct that people can seize on norms, and actually the active violation of a norm, the not wearing of a tie in this case, in order to signal something about their affiliation. Right. That's my argument about conformity in general. Okay. The arbitrariness is the fact that there's this completely useless piece of clothing, right? I mean, does nothing but spread disease, right? I mean, but that's what I'm trying to talk about. It's not. Once there is a norm for anything, it can be individually fitness enhancing to conform to it, not because of the intrinsic features of the norm, but because of the communicative value of the conformity. Okay. I mean, social scientists have to wear corduroy jackets with leather patches on them, or whatever it is. It's some equally stupid thing. By the way, on your point about the seriousness, I have a colleague who will remain anonymous, who comes from a behavioral science background, but many of these the behavioral and natural sciences are starting to blend, and ran experiments in which blood tests were involved. Right? And I won't give you any more details than that. And this individual proudly gave a talk in our series. Showing slides of him/her, won't distinguish, conducting the experiment wearing a lab coat, a white lab coat with the name embroidered on the lab coat, right? Because now you're a real scientist if you use machines that go bing and you wear a lab coat, right? It's obviously trying to signal to a different audience. But on the question of costless derogation of out-group members, right, as opposed to costly punishment of in-group members with whom you might form coalitions. I agree that certainly a lot of what looks like punishment is really cheap talk, in the sense that it doesn't cost you anything to say you think ill of out-group members. Right? Kevin Haley, the student whom I did the iSpots work with, his master's thesis, which he will probably never publish because he's very conservative and he doesn't think the effect sizes are big enough to crow about. It is interesting, and I mentioned it to a number of people, perhaps you, Nikolai, as well, but what he showed is that people are more punitive towards norm violators who resemble themselves than they are when they resemble the victims of a norm violation. And there's an audience effect. So he did an internet-based study where we presented people with real crimes where people did horrible things to other people, and then asked, how angry are you about this? How much should this person be punished? And who's around you while you're participating? Are you sitting at the library where there are lots of people around you, or are you in your room by yourself? And what he finds is that when the subject resembles the perpetrator and not the victim, then there's an audience effect, in the sense that when people are around you, you're more angry. Okay? So it's not trying to make the world safe for the victims. It's trying to show I'm a good guy, not like that bad guy that you might mistake me for. Okay? Which is a special version of, it's kind of the George Bush, with us or against us version of the coalitional signaling argument.
Sure, so it's it's really compatible. People do not really care about the outside out-group members. They just want to have the time.
Yeah, but you could have easily argued, well, the people ought to be really punitive when they resemble the victim because they want to protect folks like themselves, right?
It would be group selection. They don't want they care about their reputation. They don't care about their group number.
Yeah, I think that's what's going on. That's my explanation of the result.
Could I just make one point as to the eye studies? If the cues we were talking about are addressing cues, or which implies that they're being seen or attended to, then one of the cues is a high but imperfect contingent reactivity. Perfect contingent reactivity is no good because that's like only your own body perfectly contingent. So if you would have a kind of a mirror in front of the guy while making the choices, they have to kind of pit against each other the presence of the eyes, but a perfectly contingently moving image. So you should have less effect in that case than if you would have, eyes that you would have some control over, high but imperfect control.
Yeah, people argue a lot about what the eyes mean. Okay, so one of the competing hypotheses hypotheses that's been advanced for this result is that it's an empathy inducer, right? That it's not that you're managing your reputation; it's that you're thinking about how your actions affect other people because seeing this other individual there. Another is some version of self-consciousness that doesn't involve reputation; it just causes self-reflection. There is one experiment that it's quite old, but I can't reconstruct it now, that involves a mirror and the opportunity to take from the commons. And people are less exploited of the commons when the mirror is there than when it's not. That's perfectly contingent behavior, but then again, it could be this, self-awareness thing. So Jesse Baring and I are actually planning a series of studies about the perception of observability that doesn't address exactly that issue, but we might be able to speak to it a little bit. So.
Well, there's a whole social psychology literature on doing things in front of the mirror, and I even remember that Tom Bever used to show that you show differential linguistic intuition when you have to take off the example sentences from a mirror, and you are more agreeing with the generative semanticist than the...
Let me just share with you one of my favorite, completely neglected and unrecognized studies, which is cited in the iSpots paper if anybody's interested, which is a traffic psychologist. So American psychology is so large that we have specialties like traffic psychology. Her dissertation was driving around a large city in Colorado in a car, and whenever she came to a red light, she stopped. And if the car behind her had a convertible top, the top that can go up and down, right? When the light turned green, she didn't go. She just stayed there. She had a stopwatch and a clipboard, and she recorded how long it took until the person behind her honked, and how many times they honked, okay, before they finally just pulled around her and left, okay? And when the car behind her was a convertible and the top is up, they honk sooner and more often than when the top is down. Okay? Now, obviously, there's a big piece of metal on the front of your car, a license plate, that identifies you. There's a record that says who you are. You aren't anonymous, right? But the evolved psychology didn't exist in a world of license plates, right? I mean, it didn't, right? That is, you feel anonymous when the top is up, and so you're more, in this case, more aggressive because the consequences of your of retribution or less. And you're enforcing a norm, which is when the light turns green, go, idiot, don't stand there.
I think, Pascal. Okay, so let's return when?